Thank you. Good question. I'm gonna go home and test myself inappropriately. Don't
Big round of applause for Big Round.
I'm like, thank you.
So you're talking about the don't judge me thing. There's two things where I keep thinking I'm being judged. Like, have you read like crime, like detective novels and stuff where they have handwriting analysis?
Yeah.
Every time I sign anything, I'm like, man. I mean, you give it to the doctor, you go to the doctor, you bring a check to the bank or something, and they're like, oh.
They're gonna catch me.
The second thing is I went to the doctor a little while ago, and just had a sore throat. And the lady's like, okay, I'm gonna have to use this little giant Q-tip on a wooden stick to reach into your throat.
Did you just say little giant Q-tip?
I did. That's okay. When Garrett was up here, he's like, yeah, I was with my grandma at the beginning of drinking.
Yeah.
I'm visiting, but. So she's like, open up, and I'm like, and she puts it down there and she swabs it. I got nothing. There's no gag reflex, nothing like that. She takes it out. She's like, wow, you're really good at not gay. And I'm like, don't judge me. She did not find that amusing. All right. Next person on stage is Steve. Put your hands together, Steve. So a staggering percentage of people in the United States believe that the Bible is the literal Word of God. Now, the numbers change depending on how exactly you ask the question. But in general, like 65% of the American population believes that the Bible is the inerrant Word of God, word for word, which is silly for a great number of reasons. But I don't want to focus on that. I just want you to keep that number in mind. Think of how many people today make decisions based on this Bible. And I have absolutely nothing against the Bible. It's got some awesome stuff in it. That's not what I'm up here to do. What I'm up here to say is, what was the Bible in the very first days of Christianity? And the answer is, it didn't exist. There was no Bible. After Jesus died, and his disciples went around preaching the word, converting, there were several different versions of Christianity. You can look at the Bible, you can find where some of them complain, or for example, Paul complains that some of the other disciples don't like him because he is changing some of the rules. So while Paul was going around like, Christ saved everybody, Gentile, Jew alike, some of the other disciples were pretty much aiming at just the Jewish population. It was a Jewish cult, and it still maintained most of the Jewish beliefs. So here we have, in the very earliest days, before any of the books of the Bible were written, we have at least two competing versions of Christianity. One which was much more open, Gentiles and Jews, and one that was still pretty much a Jewish sect, a Jewish cult. It expected you to follow the dietary restrictions and most of the general beliefs. It just believed that Jesus was the Messiah. So most of the books of the Bible, outside of the Old Testament, the Jewish texts, were written anywhere from maybe as early as like 46 years after the death of Christ to 130 years after. Think about how that would be today. Now, we live in a world where we write everything down, where we have the internet, where we have phones with notepad on it, where we have pencils or pens available everywhere. But imagine living in a society where none of that existed and trying to remember a story from 128 years ago, because it wasn't you that was there with Jesus. This is a story that you heard from somebody who's heard a story of somebody who was maybe there, maybe that many generations ago. And now you're going to write a book or a letter in the words of someone trying to tell about this Messiah. Now these are some of the earliest ones. Now the church, the early church, did not have a Bible. The very first attempts at a Bible didn't happen until hundreds of years after the death of Christ. Hundreds of years. I mean, it would be one thing, like for some of the first letters that were written 46 to 80 years after. Imagine without any note-taking devices, you writing a book of the Bible 80 years afterwards. That's like somebody nowadays writing about World War II 80 years after. You're not going to write down any notes until 80 years. How accurate would you be? No matter how amazing you are at remembering, your views are going to be somewhat limited. But as far as the Bible itself, you have all of these different Gospels, all of these different Acts and Psalms, all of these different stories floating around. The early Christian church did not have a Bible. What they had were scrolls. They had little itty-bitty booklets that they would have that would share some of this information. But no two churches, and by churches I mean houses where people would gather to discuss these things. No two churches necessarily had the same version of the same books, or even the same books at all. The Bible that we have right now is composed of ones that certain early church leaders deemed were what they considered to be the most accurate. But there was no solid agreement. Books like the Songs of the Shepherd of Hermas, the Gospel of Matthew, there was the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. I mean, there are all sorts of early Christian writings that never got included. And it's not because people didn't believe them. There were plenty of people who believed that these were valuable parts of the experience. So when somebody today says it's not in the Bible, the Bible is the literal Word of God, what were those first hundreds of years? What was Christianity before it became an imperial power, before Constantine made it the official religion? How could we have a more real Christianity now than they had in those first couple hundred years afterwards? It kind of boggles my mind. You didn't need the Bible back then to be a Christian. And even if there were conflicting or competing different versions of the same Gospels or the same letters, who cared? The early church did not hate disagreement in some ways, the same way we hate it now. Or even look back just a few hundred years. Bibles that were published during the 17th century or the 18th century often had English, Greek, Latin, Aramaic, Syriac, all of these different languages, all of these different translations of early texts side by side. And for the Old Testament, they would put in Hebrew. So you could go and look at it yourself. How different is that from us now? Or rather than saying, look at all of these different versions, here's the same verse translated over and over and over again. We're going to give you a dictionary at the end of this Bible, and we're going to give you a grammar guide at the end of this, so you could try to understand some of these other languages, so you could see for yourself what the translators did when they took this verse from its original language and turned it into the language that you know and understand now into English or German or whatever it was. How different that we've gone from this. Think about it, look at it, read it. Here's all the things you know, to it's the literal Word of God, and here is how you take it. Here is what it means. If you hear somebody saying that, they're trying to sell you something, even if it's just their own bullshit. There's a lot of good things in the Bible. There are lots of appalling things in the Bible. But one of the things that is most interesting and overlooked is it doesn't say much of anything very clearly. Almost everything requires you to think, to research and learn and discuss and debate, which makes me think, and I mentioned this before in other speeches and stage rants, whatever you want to call them, it is not by accident that Jesus spoke in parables. comes from a very, very traditional Jewish outlook of literalism. And the Pharisee at the time was very, very literal. Exactly what is written. It is the letter of the law, not the spirit of the law that is important. And he chose to speak in parables. You can't make laws out of parables. It doesn't work as well. If you want to have a law, you say, this is what you do. This is what you don't do. And those things you can find in Leviticus. Those laws exist. So why would somebody from this background willingly choose to speak only in a format that could not be taken literally? This is what the early church was like. Different texts, no one doctrine, lots of competing ideas. Was Jesus just a man who was inspired? Was he completely God? Was he something in between? These were not idle questions. The early Christian church killed themselves, not metaphorically, but absolutely literally, to eradicate these heresies from one another. The Bible that we have now is what was given to us by the victors of these wars. Now, if we believe that God chooses the victors of these wars, then I guess that makes it okay. However, if you believe that the realm of men is primarily controlled by man, then perhaps you should look back to the early days of Christianity. It wasn't quite so certain. Thank you.
Made me think.